we continue the discussion on the different typologies that Charles Handy has seen in making sense out of how organizations function. We have seen the Zeus oriented, the Apollo oriented, the Athena oriented organization, and now we move on to what could be called the Dionysus oriented organization, which is really an oriented culture towards the individual. It is a cluster of individual stars loosely gathered within a boundary, attributed to Dionysius, god of wine and song, the god of self-oriented individuals. You name it, and you have got an organization there where each one is in orbit, but an orbit of his own choosing. How they stick together is a matter which only Dionysius could explain. What are the characteristics of such an organization? It exists only to enable individuals to exercise their skills and talents. Each preserves his own freedom and identifies and feels owned by none. It is the organization preferred by professionals such as lawyers, doctors, and indeed teachers. A barrister's chamber is the purest example of a Dionysian organization. Each barrister, each teacher, each doctor, each lawyer would be doing his own thing, coming together only when certain explicit interests are involved. The individual practitioner, not the organization, is supreme. Management hierarchies and control mechanisms can only be established by consent, and that will be given only if it is necessary for individuals to cooperate to manage the environment. I am reading from the PPT for you to understand that yes, to organize you do not have to feel bound. To organize, you merely have to recognize that unless you hang together, you will hang separately. So, basically people give their consent only if it is necessary for individuals to cooperate to manage the environment. A Dionysius person will regard an organization as somewhere to do his own thing. He will owe his little allegiance to their boss. His allegiance is to his personal client. Now, clearly this is not an organization which is admirably suited for manufacturing or production processes, but I would wish you to know that such organizations can and do exist. Ways of thinking and learning therefore in a Dionysian oriented organization is different, because Dionysius people tend to think professionally. They seek to learn from life rather than from an expert in their field. I am sure you have heard that before. From being immersed in new experiences is their learning school. They will often move out of a post of project when they have thoroughly mastered it, a habit influencing many others, but infuriating to the employers, because it is often limited to the opportunities for learning and development. Now, this works in certain professions, it does not work in others. It works in certain types of organizations, it does not work in others, but as a model it does exist, and I wished you to know that it can happen. In such an organization, ways of influencing and changing can also be listed. It is hard to influence a Dionysian. Their egos are high, their self perception is very flattering, and above all they can be very difficult to deal with, because they think the world of themselves. In fact, the fact is everyone thinks the world of himself, but the Dionysian thinks a little more of himself than many others do. They tend to respect only people, and it is impossible to predict what they will do with respect to them, because the egos cannot be permitted to clash. It can be talent this month and it can be personality the next. They change trends to involve exchange and protracted negotiations. So, they are on the whole difficult to deal with, and it may be a good idea if several of them could be put on to negotiations which you really do not want to conclude, but you want to buy time for them to go along, but that I am saying in a lighter vein. Now, to take the discussion further, I think I need to give you some sort of a summary which will come in a moment after I have mentioned to you the ways of motivating and rewarding a Dionysian. A Dionysian are loners who gather in communities and partnerships for their own convenience. Please note that John White's organization man is missing here. They seek individual rewards and freedoms, particularly freedom to control their own time. Organization sanctions tend to have little or no effect on such individuals. Clearly, you do not want them in a organization which needs very high organizational discipline, but then there is always space for everyone depending upon the type of tasks to be done. Coming to the summary, therefore, this presents the 4 typologies in a matrix form: the style, good for, power, and how. The kind of organization which has Zeus orientation is good for speed, institutions, risks, for it is control of goodies and empathy, and how eyeball to eyeball, cruel, no memos, trust. So, the driving principle is eyeball to eyeball, it can be cruel, but depends upon trust. So far as the Apollo model is concerned, it is good for having order, good for having rules, good for having profitability, control systems. The locus of power is within the organization, it looks after you, it has job titles, it has organization chart. It works through rules and it works through procedures. So, you can compare the style, the Zeus style with the Apollo style. I will now go on to show to you the Dionysian style and the Athenian style. The Dionysian style: problems, solutions, upmarket thrust, wrong first time. Examples you can find in Concord, NASA. Power: it lies in expertise, it lies in talent, it lies in creativity. How? It works through plans, it works through budgets, it works through controls. But if you get to the Athenian style, it is good for doing your own thing, individuality, freedom. It works on charisma, it has energy and ethic. To take you back very quickly, therefore, so that you can get an overall perspective, compare the 4 styles over what it is good for, where power lies, and how it is done. I will leave it on the screen very briefly so that you can absorb it, internalize it, because from here I am going to move on things which work in the Indian environment and how it operates, because talking to you about the kind of analogies which Charles Handy has seen is important, but it would have limited applications in the Indian environment, which will have all these models undergo a refraction, because understanding organizations in India would require understanding the dynamics of situation in India. A very quick look at the Dionysian and the Athenian model, and then we move on to the Indian scene for you to understand it better. But before we move on to the Indian scene, I would like to give you a few quotes which will serve as a link between what we have done so far and what I propose to do in the remaining half hour or so. I quote Erich Hoffer, who said, "In times of change, the learner will inherit the earth, while the learned are beautifully equipped for a world that no longer exists." Which means what? The world belongs to a growing person. So, whether it is model A or model B, please make sure you keep pace with what the circumstances require. Goethe, the German scholar, said, "Knowing is not enough, we must apply, and this is the heart of management, the application. Willing is not enough, we must do." But I think there is something to be said for Arthur Clarke, who makes a statement which I find very interesting. Before you become too entranced, with gorgeous gadgets. I hope you are following this carefully. Before you become too entranced with gorgeous gadgets and mesmerizing video displays, let me remind you that information is not knowledge. Let me remind you that information is not knowledge, knowledge is not wisdom, wisdom is not foresight. Each grows out of the other, and we need them all, said Arthur C. Clarke. Then I decided to share with you a quotation from the classical book, which many of you may have read, others may not have known, but I recommend it to you just as warmly as I would recommend Hitopadesh. It is the book is full of worldly wisdom for grown-ups. The character is Winnie the Pooh. It is a bear with small brains, well intentioned, but forever getting in trouble somewhere or doing things suboptimally, but a lovable, adorable character. And the author A. Millen says, here is Edward Bear. Edward Bear is Winnie the Pooh, and you have to visualize a staircase where somebody is coming down the steps, and in this case the name of the character was Christopher Brown, and he is being followed by Edward Bear, and poor Bear, being a person of small brains, can't think, always goes down the steps with his head first. So, visualize a child coming down the step with a bear head first coming down the steps, then you will understand what the statement is. Here is Edward Bear coming downstairs now, bump, bump, bump on the head of his head behind Christopher Brown. It is as if, it is as far as he knows, the only ways of coming downstairs, but sometimes he feels there really is another way. If only he would stop bumping for a moment and think of it. Now, this is the essence of understanding, running, dealing with organizations. Most of us are exasperated by organizations because we can't see why it should behave the way they do, but that is because organizations do not pause to think of a better way, perhaps being like Winnie the Pooh. Now, let us move on to the Indian environment and the Indian context, and you will notice that the point which I want to make is about understanding Indianness in the organizational context, so that you can understand organizations better. My first proposition to you is what happens in an Indian organization may also be partly understood in terms of deprivation and experiences of gender relationships, power in the formative years of an individual's life. Now, in many Indian organizations, there are cases of use of power in a manner which is not really conducive to meeting organizational growth. Why does it happen? Because in a lot of Indian families, the individuals have simply not exercised their judgment for decision making. Uncle, aunt, parents, grandparents have exercised the rights. Therefore, they have had a sense of deprivation over the courses they chose, the person they married, where they settled. So, when they get into a work organization and they find that they really have to exercise power, it is like being given a gadget which they have never used, but they have always wanted to have on their hand. So, there is a huge tendency to hit an extreme, an assertiveness which would make up for the earlier years of deprivation. Then this business of gender relationship, which is becoming increasingly more conspicuous in organizational life. Real experience of gender relationships have in most families been encased within the bounds of the family relations. The kind of personality which grows when gender relationships are moderated under family influences will obviously be different from the kind of personality which grows in a society where gender relationships are not mediated by the family, but are in an open system. Now, I am not here to exercise judgment on which works better, which does not, because there are merits and demerits of either. The implication this has for the organization is that gender relationships, which come from a sense of deprivation of one variety or another, will give rise to a particular type of an organization person. He may have limitations in handling gender because he has never handled it in an open environment, and yet it affects the use of power, especially if you have a female boss. Now, this is not the best time to shred it, but this is an important time to put it on the map for you to feel that when you work in an organization which is in India, or when you work in an organization which has essentially Indians, or when you work in an organization which is in an Indian ethos, and there are a lot of Indian ethos oriented organizations abroad, because there are a lot of Indian companies which have moved abroad, which are largely manned by Indians. You will find that the issues are unique and need to be understood before you can understand organizations, and that is the larger point I want to make. The Indian hierarchical system of the family life also has to account for this, because Indian families are by and large hierarchical in their content. It may or may not be evil, it may or may not be good, but I am describing it in a clinical sense. Therefore, once you move out of a hierarchical system to say you are now positioned in a high-tech organization which largely works in a project mode, to facilitate this transfer from a hierarchical system to a flat system of decision making requires a passage of transition which has to be looked at very carefully during the induction program. Unfortunately, not many organizations have the induction program which covers this. Now, for many who will be seeking jobs after their completion of their undergraduate engineering degree, it would be useful for them to keep in mind that this ritual of transition has to be carried out very systematically before you have a level of comfort of living in organizations which are functioning in different manner. After all, family is also an organization. It may be functioning in a particular manner. You go out of your home and you start your day in office. You may be working in an entirely different framework of organization decision making. So, it is possible that a person may be asked to operate and deal with different types of organization all in a day's work. A certain degree of internal genius to deal with differentiated organizations, therefore, would be a legitimate outcome of any study of understanding organizations, and this is what I am trying to put across to you. The perceived resistance of strong traditions in modern or modernizing societies, binding ways of people rooted in the past and to some degree referring to the past, has been recognized as a characteristic of the Indian society. I am displaying it on the screen so that you can read it, absorb it. I won't mind if you disagreed with it, but I think it is important that you think about it. I think it is important that you mull over it and see to what extent this conditions behavior in an organization, and I will read it out for you to follow better. The perceived resistance of strong traditions in modern or modernizing societies binding ways of behavior rooted in the past and to some degree referring to the past has been recognized as a characteristic of the Indian society. You will notice again here, like everything else in my presentation, no judgment is exercised. The past is not debunked. In fact, my view is the past cannot be debunked, because the past lives in the present in many, many ways. The past is not also eulogized, though there could be a good case of eulogizing it. All that you have to recognize is that, like every variable, past has its banal elements, past has its positive elements. You have to selectively build upon the positive elements and eliminate the banal elements, and that is the way forward, and that is a choice and an exercise which any Indian has to undertake in adjusting to an organizational culture with which he may be comfortable, or an organizational culture with which he may not be comfortable. The manager influences other persons through wielding symbols that have meaning for these persons and motivates them towards desired action. Please recognize that organization management is essentially a symbolic act. An action acquires its legitimacy or otherwise by virtue of the symbol behind the action that is being perpetrated. The aspect of individualism and collectivism is important, and this is a straight acknowledgement of the contribution of Gerty Hofstede to understanding organizations. He has spent considerable time defining individualism and collectivism. I have tried to capture the key thoughts of Gerty in the remaining two statements, where he has said individualism stands for preference of a loosely knit social frame work in a society in which individuals are supposed to take care of themselves and their immediate families only. Obviously, this is a post-industrial ethos, and of course, many of us who have grown up or aspire to grow up in a Western oriented tradition have a lot of admiration for individualism. You are welcome to it. I have no observations to make. But I would also like to draw your attention to the opposite of individualism, that is collectivism, which stands for preference of a tightly knit social framework. If you were to belong to either of these two worlds, it would be a mercy, because individually oriented organizations have their own social networks, their own social safety mechanisms. Collectivist societies have their own societal networks, their own mechanisms of bailing people out in distress or in times of need. But there is a huge problem when the safety networks of collectivism have disappeared, and the safety networks of individualism have not replaced the networks of collectivism, which have disappeared. And it is for many of us a fact of life that we have delinked ourselves from the collectivist operation and not have the advantage of the individualistic operation, but that is another matter altogether. What I seek to focus your attention on is very simply the need to realize that understanding organizations is as much a part of organizational culture, and the kind of culture people bring into an organization, that is the culture of the organization OFF, which becomes the culture of OF, the organization. and it is not something which is easy to understand. It requires a lot of clinical sense, a lot of ability to feel things over your skin, and it cannot be put down in collectivist terms. It cannot be put down in terms which have to do with analysis, statistics, programming, and the engineer, when he moves over from being a designer of a system to being a individual or professional who puts that system to productive use, will need to add these skills to the current skills which he has. An individualistic society can often be prone to nepotism, favoritism, and would look down favors done to relatives. In a collectivist society, if you did not work for your relatives and if you did not work from the segment of the society from which you came, after retirement, when you go back to that society, for the marriage of your children, when you go back to the society, for your social safety networks, when you go back to that society, they would make sure you feel the heat. Now, again, not a matter of value judgment, a matter of understanding which you can bring to understanding how organizations function. I would wish you to recognize this clearly, that models of our organizations and design of jobs will have to consider the concerned culture, subculture, and symbolic structures available. In my limited experience of consulting and researching, I have found that methods of developing viable design of such jobs are still to be developed and remains a concern of organization management, on which I personally believe that management research has to cover huge distances to be able to manage these concerns, because unless you are able to design jobs and develop models of organizations which have a level of synergy with the culture in which they are embedded, they will simply not perform. And if you recall two keywords which I have used on other occasions too through this presentation, one is effectiveness and the other is performance. So, a lot of performance of organizations is possible only if you have design of jobs which are at a level of comfort with cultures in which they are embedded, and in the ultimate analysis it is important to recognize that this is a part of understanding organizations. Now, if you are dealing with human beings and if you are dealing with organizations, the two wheels on which this course moves, you would have heard of management by objectives, which was talked of by Drucker, theory X and theory Y, which was propounded by MacGregor, and if you have not heard of it, these are buzz names that you should be broadly familiar with. This is a part of being a professional literate. There is achievement motivation that McClelland had talked about, there is managerial grid that Blake and Mouton had talked about, there is systems X and system Y, which Likert had talked about, theory Z, which Auchi had talked about. Almost without exception, the cultural assumption has not been explored by any of these people. What I am submitting is so simple, it can be put at the back of a postage stamp. To understand organizations, taking recourse to organization theory of well known names, which you heard me say myself, you should be able to name and be aware of, is not good enough. There has to be, if I might say so in the best sense of the word, a native wisdom brought in, I might say fielded, to understand organizations, without which it does not work. So, after all the scientific method has been exhausted, and after all the wisdom of notable names, of which I gave you a generous sprinkling, have been used, there is no substitute for your own intelligence and your own ability to understand. If one was talking of a medical science, this would have surfaced in the form of a clinical sense. The craft of management requires huge clinical sense, and in few things it is as prominent and as essential as it comes out in understanding organizations. Again, in an Indian environment, the performance appraisal of a subordinate becomes a tricky one. If two-way of communication between superior and subordinate is unlikely to grow or get institutionalized, the suitability of this type of appraisal system as originated in industrial West becomes doubtful. Now, as I draw to the end of the dealing with the topic understanding organizations, and as I try to wind up the main arguments which I have been trying to make, one of the derivations is obvious. After you have learnt of all the models and recognized all the cultural paradigms and all the compulsions of heritage and ethos and linkages amongst them, management action requires selection of tools which will deliver within an organization. And the important takeaway for you in this kind of a discussion is simply this: if you do not understand organizations, you can't work in it, you can't work through it, you can't work it, because you would have difficulties in having the proper management tools which would operate in that organization. Now, if you are with me in understanding that, I seek to give you an elaboration with the use of the intervening variable of the performance appraisal systems. Why is it that almost organization for organization, the number of people who are dissatisfied with the way performance is appraised in their organization is almost as large, indeed very often larger than the people who are reconciled to it? I have not yet seen anybody who is really ecstatic at a systems level with the way performance appraisal is conducted in his organization. They all realize that it will be working at a suboptimal level, perhaps that is the truth. But then the level of comfort which it gives to most of the organization people must surely be larger than the level of comfort which is denied to people in terms of numbers who are affected by it. Because effectiveness of an organization in its ability to achieve results will be a factor of the way performance is measured in organizations, and for that again understanding organizations is important. So, my submission to you: organizations are to be understood not only because they are to be dealt with, organizations are to be understood because they have to be operated for results. Organizations are to be understood because it creates the climate for development, and development is the heart of the matter. I would recommend your attention to the need for formalization, standardization, ritualization of organizational processes. You are of course conscious that we will be reverting back to discussion of organizational structure and processes subsequently. But each topic of a module has a message to give, and the message which the topic understanding organizations has to give for this module is that understanding organizations is required not only to operate organizations, not only to handle intervening variables, but for formalization, for standardization, for ritualization of the organizational process. I would also like to draw your attention to some of the defining characteristics of the Indian ethos. This, irrespective of whatever affiliation you may have, caste wise, religion wise, region wise, old boys tag wise, an Indian is an Indian because of many defining characteristics, one of them being the emphasis which he puts on his izzat. Now, I do not know how to translate izzat. A free translation would be prestige, but izzat is something much more by prestige. Izzat has a huge aura around it, and in our culture izzat is usually lodged in the face, and it is correlated with the color red. If you are red on your cheeks, then you feel particularly pretty within yourself. So, when your izzat or prestige is high, you get that feeling that your face is red, and the color black is with the denigration of izzat or prestige, or the denigration of that respect. So, again it is lodged in the face, something very Asian and Indian at that. Now, if you have to operate an organization with people who have this as a cardinal belief, then you have to recognize that Indian culture is a highly prestige oriented culture, and loss of social esteem can be felt to be more painful than physical maltreatment. Yes, that needs to be heard again. The loss of social prestige or social esteem can be felt to be more painful than physical maltreatment. So, I intend in the next few minutes to walk you through with some of the organizational implications of this theory, and I want you to read very carefully the 7 items which I have flagged for your attention. There is in Indian organizations the need for subordinate consultation. Once you do that, you may find that there is an acceptability of paternalistic management. People recognize the meaning of status difference and they respect old age, but manners for getting redressal for grievances has to be well thought through. Now, why do I have to point these things out to you? If you put it all together, it is quite a hodgepodge of Zeus, Apollo, Athena and Dionysius. Therefore, stop looking for neat categories in understanding organizations, and the list is not over yet. Feasibility of certain leadership packages such as management by objectives is always sought for in an Indian organization. So, there is a bit of a duplicate transaction. If you do not know what duplicate transaction is, do not worry. Maybe not in this course, but some other time when you lead a little bit of transactional analysis, you will learn that your facial expression, bodily language may be one, your intentions may be another. When you are having a confidential conversation with someone and somebody enters whom you do not want around, maybe at a peer level or at a senior level, then what do you say? Please come join us. What you really mean is, please go, do not join us. Now, that is called a duplicate transaction. Duplicate transaction is transaction which works at 2 levels. Very often an Indian is caught in that claptrap. Therefore, management by objectives is very often something which in organization requires duplicate transaction. It is not central to your understanding of understanding organizations, but I find a need to draw your attention to this to outline the care with which you need to walk through this domain to be able to handle it. And I have already talked to you about the feasibility of the appraisal systems in general. Therefore, I need to repeat for your better understanding. Understanding Indian organizations means need for subordinate consultation, acceptance of paternalistic management, often as a follow-up of the first, meaning of a status difference, respect for old age, manners of getting redressal for grievances, feasibility of certain leadership packages as management by objectives, and feasibility of appraisal systems in general. Now, you do not have to agree to all this elaboration. No sample size is 100%, and I could myself cite exceptions to this in very many Indian organizations, because there are Indian organizations and an Indian organization. And what do I mean by saying there are Indian organizations and there are Indian organizations? If there be a typology, then you will find organizations working through very traditional methods of governance, operation, producing results, and organizations with very modern forms of governance, functioning and operating results. In other words, as I said, to start bringing the threads in, tying them up together for you to conclude with, there are organizations and organizations, but in the ultimate analysis, every organization has its own characteristic and has to be understood on its own terms. I would like to conclude by pointing out that one should pay attention to the achievement motivation versus relationship motivation, again a driving factor in understanding the functioning of an organization. The concept of quality of work life, career expectations, and the acceptability of an ideal picture of a manager as aggressive masculine hero with superhuman qualities, taking quick and important decisions, etc. Now, again you see contradictory phenomena having to coexist, achievement motivation versus relationship motivation, and the ideal picture of a manager as an aggressive masculine hero. So, it is like a photograph of one negative on another negative on yet another negative. To making sense out of it from your experience is a journey which will have to be covered with care, careful observation, ability to introspect, and above all ability to interpret and apply in a sensitive manner, which is fair to management theory, but yet is consistent with the kind of environment in which it is embedded, and you would be on the road of understanding organizations and perhaps making some sense out of it.